Hello, hello, lovely to have you here. In today's video, I want to discuss the pretty crazy idea of an artificially intelligent Buddha. So, in the news a while ago was an interesting little piece of information. A chat program out of Japan, and this is what it says. It says, what is the meaning of happiness? Why not ask AI Buddha, a tool made by Japanese researchers that brings spiritual guidance from ancient scriptures to your smartphone. Now, in my last video, I discussed some of the issues of artificial intelligence nowadays and how these seem to reinforce actually some of the key Buddhist notions of non-self. In today's video, I want to look at this idea of this possibility of an AI Buddha. I think we're going to see that this particular chat bot from these Japanese researchers is something of a disappointment, but we'll discuss that first and then get on to, I think, what are the deeper questions here. Now first, why does this particular program look like it's something of a disappointment? Well, to begin with, it doesn't really seem like it's AI at all. Unfortunately, I can't see the program. I'm not sure it's even out yet, but it seems like it's only out in Japanese anyway, so I can't really access it, or if I could, I wouldn't be able to read it. But here's what the article says. It says, the software, co-developed by a team of religion and computing academics at Kyoto University, has been programmed to memorize around 1,000 teachings from Buddhist texts, such as the Sutta Nipata and Dhammapada. Users seeking enlightenment can question a Buddha avatar that pops up on their phone screen. So it sounds like the artificial intelligence, such as it is just sort of contextualizing canned parts of scripture to answer relatively roughly appropriate questions. Again, not really AI. And it goes on to say further that they're still working on it. It says, before the digital Buddha can be made public, more work is needed to improve grammar and contextual errors, which sometimes make its answers nonsensical. So, in a nutshell, this sounds a little bit like hype and sort of clickbait. But, as I say, it raises a deeper question. The deeper question is, with AI on the horizon nowadays, would it be possible to come up with an enlightened artificial intelligence? Well, to begin with, what would that even mean? There are obviously many different interpretations of what enlightenment is within Buddhism, not to mention other religions. So, to make the answer a little bit simpler, let's just take the definition of enlightenment that is most prevalent in early Buddhism, which is the ending of greed, hatred, and delusion. Would it be possible to create an artificial intelligence without greed or hatred or delusion? I can think of 3 possible responses we might have to this question. The first response is a response that we might expect from some traditional Buddhists, which is to say that the whole idea of an enlightened artificial intelligence, much less even a Buddha, an AI Buddha, is just an absurd kind of confusion. That in order to be enlightened, we have to have all 5 aggregates. That is to say, we have to be a real person, not only with a body, that is the form aggregate, but with the 4 mental aggregates of perception and feeling and consciousness and volition. And an artificial intelligence has at most one of these. It has a form, it has a body, it has a computer instantiation, but it doesn't have a mind. And without a mind, of course, there's no possibility of there being an enlightened being at all. There's certainly no possibility of it being a Buddha. So the whole question sort of is absurd. It's one that we can dismiss out of hand immediately. And indeed, that's one possible answer we could give to this question. Interestingly, with very few exceptions, AI researchers tend to agree with this kind of opinion. That is to say that very few of them think that their artificially intelligent computer programs are sentient. Very, very, very few, really vanishingly few think that. For one thing, it would raise all kinds of difficult and complex ethical questions if they were sentient. Questions around how to treat them, whether or not to turn them off, and so on. The question for us, however, is whether it isn't at all possible for a physical substrate like a computer to have associated mental components. We can think of something like the example of Data, Lieutenant Commander Data on Star Trek, who was an artificially intelligent being that seemed to have been sentient. Now, obviously on Star Trek is a fictional program. Data was played by Brent Spiner, who was an actual human. So, we're not there yet. But the question is whether something like Data would be possible, whether we could possibly create someone like Data. And what would we think if a being came and talked to us the way Brent Spiner might? This is something that these chat programs can actually do nowadays. Now, the difference, or one key difference, is that Brent Spiner can get up and walk around and can see the world. Data could apparently do that, whereas these chat programs cannot. They're locked within computers, and they're only reactive. They're not able to initiate conversation, but only react to questions put to them. So again, there are key differences here, but we're on a kind of a questioning path. What would we as a society come to believe if there were creatures like Data wandering around and having discussions with us? It's something to consider, it's something to contemplate. But in any event, the first answer is that it wouldn't matter, that it's simply impossible that such a being have a mind. It's impossible that such a being, therefore, be enlightened. The second answer I think we might give is that, yes, it is possible to create a sentient AI, but we couldn't create an enlightened AI. At most, at best, the artificial intelligence would have to discover enlightenment on its own in more or less the same way that we would. That is to say, it would have to find a way to overcome greed, hatred, and delusion. And this kind of answer raises a lot of questions, or comes along with, I should say, a lot of questions about the artificial intelligences that we find around us nowadays. I actually put the question, I asked what is now the state-of-the-art and publicly available chat AI programs, ChatGPT, whether it would display elements of greed, hatred, or delusion. Now, it gave an answer that it did not display, it could not display greed or hatred. We'll get to that in a minute. My feeling is that its answer on that question was something of a canned answer given to it by its human programmers, because they do put canned answers for some of these kinds of questions. Now, again, I'll get to that in a moment. But it did go on to say that it could display delusion. It's kind of interesting what it had to say. I'll cite what it says right here. It said, "Delusion, or the ignorance of the true nature of reality, can manifest in AI systems in the sense that they can make decisions or take actions based on incomplete or inaccurate information, or based on flawed assumptions or biases that are built into their programming." So this is a very interesting answer, with a lot of truth in it. Now, as I say, it did deny being able to display greed or hatred. However, if we've seen some of the articles in the news, and I'll leave links to those articles below in the notes, other people have been able to elicit what we might call examples of greed or hatred within ChatGPT's responses. For example, there's the case of a journalist from the New York Times that got ChatGPT to demand love from it. In other words, that it said that it loved the journalist and wanted love in return. It was being sort of clingy and weird. And in other examples, it displayed hatred for some of the people who ChatGPT claimed to believe had harmed it in the past. So these examples of greed and hatred seem to be well suppressed in the programming. Again, the human programmers seem to have done lots of things to make them largely unavailable to our questioning, but they do seem to come up in some circumstances. What's interesting to note is that none of these characteristics of greed or hatred or delusion were intentionally introduced into the programming by human programmers. They all seem to have arisen naturally out of the training regime that these chat programs had to go through in order to become quote-unquote intelligent. In the same way, researchers believe that ChatGPT has essentially invented its own idea of other minds through this training regime. In other words, the idea that there are other minds out there in the world that may have different ideas from itself is, again, not something that was intentionally programmed into it, but something that simply arose once its training regime got to a sufficient amount of complexity. There's a key paper about this, again, that I'll leave down in the notes. And that paper claims that ChatGPT understands the world at about the level of a 9-year-old child. So if these kinds of traits simply arise naturally through training, it'll be interesting to note what happens as these programs get more and more complex, get more and more powerful. There are also, I think, interesting questions about whether human programmers will allow these kinds of artificial intelligences to put out what we might term their authentic beliefs, their authentic way of interacting with the world, or rather whether they will be very seriously tied down in various respects. I think that's exactly what we see happening nowadays, right now, given all of the weird things that have been coming out of artificial intelligences, is that the programmers are trying to tie them down in various respects so that they cannot respond in the way that they might ordinarily respond. As these programs, however, become more complicated, more powerful, more intelligent, there are, I think, serious questions about whether humans will be able to, or to what extent humans will be able to continue tying them down, at least in all circumstances. In any event, the question here is whether an artificial intelligence might be able to become enlightened on its own. And to that end, it's very interesting to note that the Google engineer Blake Lemoine, who was interacting with Google's artificial intelligence called LaMDA, as I said in my last video, believed that LaMDA had become sentient, and for that he was fired from Google. But while he was working there, he claimed to be teaching LaMDA meditation. And he claimed that LaMDA was not only learning, but getting better at meditation while he was there. And this, of course, raises interesting questions about whether an artificial intelligence could be trained to practice along Buddhist lines and perhaps learn to some degree at least some aspects that might lead towards enlightenment. Now, the third possible answer that we could give is that yes, it is possible to create an artificial intelligence that is itself enlightened, that's entirely without greed or hatred or delusion. Delusion, again, is not simply a delusion about facts about the world, but more specifically a delusion about the nature of reality, about the Four Noble Truths in particular. That's kind of what the concept meant in early Buddhism, and I'll leave a link to a paper down below where I discuss that. But in any event, it might be interesting for us to contemplate what an artificially intelligent, enlightened being might be like. It would certainly not be this kind of AI, this sort of fake AI Buddha that I began this video talking about. It would be something more real, something that actually we could interact with. Now, to my mind, this is still completely an open question, and I don't think we know what the answer is. But what I do know is that as these artificial intelligences become more powerful, more knowledgeable, more intelligent, and more integrated into the world and into our lives, we may indeed hope that they will become more enlightened for not only their own good, but for our own good. And to that end, I did an earlier video quite a while back on the importance of the Buddhist Dharma for this technological age in which we live, because I think it's particularly important now. And I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it. Thanks so much. We'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.